blocks U.S. Ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, from testifying before the House today. An article in the Washington Post is looking at the impeachment inquiry and Sondland's role in it.
It's called Holding Ukraine Hostage, How the President and his allies chasing 2020 ammunition fanned a political storm. So Paul Sonne is one of the reporters behind the article, and he's joining us now to talk about it. So let's start with the title of your piece, Holding Ukraine Hostage. Does the Trump administration have that kind of leverage over Ukraine?
Yeah, actually, Ukraine is in a very difficult position. Since 2014, for the last 5 years, they've had a war against Russian proxies in their east. They're very dependent on the United States and Europe for monetary aid, as well as political leverage. In order for them to have sort of any maneuvering room and leverage against Russia, they need to have the support of the United States. So it's extremely important to them.
So let me ask you about the news of the day. The White House, as you know, has blocked the testimony of Gordon Sondland. What do you make of that decision?
Yeah, so I think it was pretty clear from the texts that were released last week and from some of our reporting that Sondland, who is a hotel magnate from the Pacific Northwest and gave a lot of money to President Trump's inauguration and then was subsequently made EU ambassador, he plays a critical role in the effort by the Trump administration, and particularly Rudy Giuliani, as well as the president, to sort of get the Ukrainian government to investigate Joe Biden. He is the central player in a lot of ways. So these messages were being sent by the president and by Rudy Giuliani, and then where the rubber hits the road in terms of communicating with Ukrainian officials, he and Kurt Volker, the special representative for Ukraine, were sort of right there in the middle of everything.
So Sondland is kind of this interesting character. Just like the president, he's a hotel guy. He really doesn't have any diplomatic experience at all, but he did donate a lot of money to the Trump campaign. Can we talk a little bit about how he ended up landing this job, and also the fact that, he's the ambassador to the EU. Ukraine is not in the EU, but he seemed to be very involved in Ukraine.
Yes. So he actually didn't, actually during the campaign, around the time of the Gold Star family scandal and the Khizr Khan scandal, he actually distanced himself from Trump and came out and said he didn't support him. Then subsequently, after Trump won, around the time of the inauguration, through a series of shell companies, he gave about $1 million to the inauguration. So he sort of re-ingratiated himself with the president and the president's team, and then landed this job, as you say, to be the U.S. ambassador to the EU. The EU job is somewhat, it's somewhat related to Ukraine in the sense of he was working on Nord Stream 2, the issues, the pipeline that the U.S. opposes from Russia into Europe, and so he was working on some peripheral issues there. But yes, it's extremely strange for someone in that position to be so deeply involved in what are essentially Ukrainian domestic issues.
And Paul, just real briefly, we talked a little bit about it at the top, but I think it may be hard for some people to understand this relationship that the Ukraine has with the United States. Ukraine is essentially dependent on the United States for protection, even though the Russians have annexed Crimea, and essentially, they are stuck in this position where the Russians are at their doorstep, and any kind of military support or any kind of economic support generally comes from the United States and our allies. And so when you read in that transcript that the president is asking Ukraine's president for a favor, what is that? I mean, just looking at the transcript and then a whistleblower complaint that subsequently came after it, does it seem that the Ukrainian president had any choice but to say, yes, here's what we'll do for you?
Yeah, so the Ukrainians were pretty apoplectic at the time. President Zelensky had just been elected, and this is kind of the first thing that lands on his doorstep right as he takes office. And his position was, I also need bipartisan support in Congress. Both the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress support giving aid to Ukraine, and so he doesn't want to alienate anyone, and he didn't actually want to get involved in any of this. And that is actually why, to some degree, the pressure got ramped up up by Trump and Rudy Giuliani, because initially he wasn't giving the assurances that they wanted that these investigations would take place. But as you point out, if he wants to retain military aid, he wants to be able to have some measure of independence against Russia, wants to maintain the financial commitments that the United States and Europe have given to Ukraine, he doesn't really have a choice. And I think that's what you see play out from the Ukrainian side over the course of the year.
But he was being advised by other diplomats to just stay out of it. This is really American domestic stuff. This is about an election and really has nothing to do with sort of international relations. But he didn't have much of an option. He sort of danced as much as he could.
Right, and Kurt Volker, the special envoy to Ukraine, was even saying that he was telling them that you know, I'm doing these things because they're coming down the pipeline, but hey, if I were you, I would really stay out of this. And they're kind of looking at him and everyone else who's advising them to do that and say, well, you know, if you look at the text of that phone call, how exactly is he supposed to do that? It was made pretty clear to him that in order to secure an Oval Office meeting with Trump, which is actually extremely important to them, arguably as important as the aid, because they need to show the Kremlin that they actually still have the backing of the United States government. So in order to do that and continue to get this military aid, they're still at war with a group of Russian proxies in the east. He wasn't given so much choice.
And finally, before we let you go, Paul, I know you cover national security for the Washington Post. You know, what we're seeing from members on the Hill, from Republicans specifically, is this idea, this notion that what the President of the United States was doing during that phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky was trying to root out corruption. And that corruption, in this particular case, had to do with the former Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. In your reporting, have you seen any indication that the President of the United States asked to investigate anybody else other than his political opponents, specifically Vice President Biden, in his attempt to root out corruption wherever it may be?
No, I mean, I don't think you have seen from this president any significant desire to go after corruption in foreign countries as a plank of U.S. foreign policy. I think you'd be hard pressed to come up with examples of that. In addition to asking them to investigate Joe Biden and his son, they were also asking them to investigate possible collusion. You know, what they have alleged is collusion between the Democrats and Ukraine in the 2016 election, because part of what all of this started as was a way to undermine the Mueller investigation and claim that, you know, Russian interference isn't really the story of the 2016 election. The real story is, you know, Ukraine colluding with the Democrats. And so they were also, and Bill Barr has been involved in this, they were also pushing the Ukrainians to investigate that. But in terms of other corruption, which is myriad in Ukraine, we didn't pick up any indication that he was interested in any of those things.
All right, Paul Sonne, thank you very much.